Thank you very much, Lynn. I was very pleased to be asked to come to this, partly because I hadn't been thinking about Blake for a while. And this was not only inviting me to do this, but if I agreed to come, compelled me to do it, to go back to the time that I'd spent probably from the middle of my undergraduate years till well into my professor years, in which I thought about little else but William Blake, because he was so hard and needed so much time. But I'd put him aside, and so when I had this opportunity to come here, I grabbed it and was particularly intrigued at trying to connect Blake not only to the 60s and the kinds of social movements I was involved in, but to the theme of the Fall Fest, which was belief. At first that seemed really interesting to me, and then I began to have second thoughts. Belief, first of all, is an interesting lens to look at almost anything. But belief did not seem to me, first of all, to be the most important feature of the 60s, at least the protest movements of the 60s. We had our beliefs, and I think we had to stand up for some of them against those condescending State Department experts who were coming to our teach-ins in the 60s and 70s and telling us, you don't know anything about Vietnam. We know more than you do because we have, access to secret documents that we can't share with you, so shut up. I mean, we at least believed in our ability to think for ourselves and stand up to that sort of fake condescension and fake expertise. But I don't think belief was the word we would use for what made us do what we did. It was more like our sense of right and wrong, our sense of morality, our sense that we can't be killing babies in a country 10,000 miles away for any belief. Sorry. So I got to think about that. Was belief really behind it? Surely in the civil rights movement that got its great second start in the 50s had much to do with belief because the black churches were so important for it. And there were many religious people in the anti-war movement and the second wave of feminism and the beginnings of the gay movement and so on. But again, it didn't seem to be belief or faith that was powering it as a whole. It had more to do with, I think, our sense of justice. So that gave me a little pause. And then I thought, well, what has Blake got to do with belief? In my many years of working on Blake, it never occurred to me that belief was a key term for him. He did talk about it. He spoke of believers and unbelievers. He didn't like, for instance, John Locke, Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, Voltaire, Rousseau, because he thought they were too rational, they were too scientific, they believed in demonstration rather than faith. So he cherished something else that you could call perhaps innocence. The Songs of Innocence, of course, is the first half of his great collection. And he denounced, and I have it here, those who would hurt the innocence of a child. He who mocks the infant's faith, he said, shall be mocked in age and death. He who shall teach the child to doubt, the rotting grave will ne'er get out. So he was firm on this, but faith, again, is not the term that one first thinks of, I think, for trying to pin Blake down, if you can pin him down. For the thing that he gave us that's most important, I think, was not faith. If it was faith in something rather unusual. I think it's just 500 years ago today, or is it tomorrow, when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door. It's right about now at Wittenberg. And Luther, of course, was known for saying that it's by faith alone that we are saved. And with some reluctance, the Catholic Church has sort of come around, I think, and agreed maybe yes, but what about works? Don't works help? But faith became the central tenet of Protestantism. We are justified by faith alone. And it doesn't matter what we do. We can obey all the laws and do all the good works. That will not save us. It's only faith. So that got me thinking along lines that Blake might plug into. It always puzzled me as to what this faith that will save us is. What's it faith in? It seems to be faith in faith. It seems to be faith that you will be saved by Christ, because Christ is our Savior, and if you believe in Him, you will be saved. There's something ultimately, I think, sort of circular about that. And with Blake, too, I wondered, well, what did Blake believe in? We know he did not believe in this gentleman. This is a magnificent engraving. It's one of the many colorings of it. There's one upstairs. It's all over the place. It used to be in every third dormitory room in the 60s. I love it. This is God the Creator, obviously. It seems to be illustrating something out of Paradise Lost by Milton, where God sets his compasses upon the deep and circumscribes the universe. But Blake didn't believe in this God. I'm quite sure of it. He talked occasionally about it, God the Father, but he didn't mean this. If we believed in this, he thought, our minds were fallen. If we believe there's a creator God and that he created us, then we are mere creatures, and that's not the God he believed in. So he didn't believe in this God. He didn't believe certainly in the 39 articles of the Church of England with the three persons of the Trinity and the original sin and all that. He did not believe in the 10 Commandments. He was rather against the 10 Commandments. Not in particular. He didn't think you should kill and murder and steal, but he thought the 10 Commandments created sin. So he was against that. He was an antinomian Christian of some sort. That is, the Christian who believed that the laws are not as important as something else. But it wasn't faith, I think, in the sense we usually mean. Blake said a number of striking things about Christianity, and I will get back to the 60s and how this may have affected us. He said that the essence of Christianity is forgiveness of sins. That's it. That the laws, and the doctrine, the Trinity, the two natures of Christ, whatever you like, the resurrection, that's at most an emblematic or symbolic story. What matters is forgiveness of sins. That's what we should do. That's what we are as Christians. It's very drastic. He also believed that if there's anything about God in us, it's the God in us. That is to say, it's the third person of the Trinity, of anyone. It's Christ in us, or the Spirit of God in us, which makes him rather like a Quaker, or I think some of the Pentecostalists today, who are rather shaky about God the Creator and Christ the Son who died in Jerusalem and so on, but believe in something in us that it redeems us perhaps, and changes us and makes us a certain kind of person. So he would go that far, I think, with the tradition. Blake also believed in brotherhood. Now today I suppose we would have to use a different word. Brotherhood is gendered. Sisterhood won't work for the same reason. Siblinghood doesn't sound right. Any ideas, any proposals? I'm really searching for a good word. Humanity. Speech. Living thinghood. Yeah. Personhood. What? Biotahood, yes. Well, the trouble with Blake is he didn't believe in, quote, nature. That's another lecture. I won't get into it, but I'll leave it with... well, I think maybe the best term might, for the time being, be the labor movement word solidarity, because it brings out the idea that we are committed to one another. But he might have disliked that because it seemed too much like we're all marching together like Spartans or something, a phalanx. And even though he believed that we should indeed be together and do things together, that word might not have clicked with him. But by brotherhood, he meant not peace and harmony, and he didn't mean all marching to the same tune. He meant something like struggle with our best friends. He meant like having a lover's quarrel with each other. He spoke of the, what he called the fierce contentions of brotherhood. I think what he imagined, his vision of the ideal world would be an eternal seminar. Finally, he believed in the annihilation of selfhood. That's his phrase. Capital S, selfhood. That's a demanding thing to say. It does sound Christian enough, right? Christians have always talked about self-sacrifice and Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and Blake did call himself a Christian. It also sounds rather Buddhist, right? That we should somehow become nothing or empty. By selfhood, I think he did not mean the soul or the spirit, which is deeper and larger. He meant what we might call self-consciousness, or the defense mechanisms that we all make to put a kind of carapace or a shell around us to keep us from getting hurt by one another. That's what I think he meant by selfhood. That's simplifying it a bit. And our task is to get rid of that, to crush it, to annihilate it. It sounds rather violent at times. When we can do that, then we can sort of love each other with full acceptance of the risks that that takes. So we're back to the question of belief. These things seem to me more important than belief per se in Blake. And so I got kind of gloomy thinking about this because I'd agreed to come and talk about Blake and belief. I thought, I have to call up these nice people in Chicago and disappoint them. I can't do this. But here I am, so I must have thought of something, and what did come to me is that the key term for Blake is the imagination, almost more than anything else. And he even went so far as to say that Jesus is the imagination. That takes him right out of normal Christianity. Jesus is the imagination. I'm quoting him, capital J, capital I. More than once he says this. So he's a Holy Ghost Christian in that he believed in Jesus in us. But what it does is give us the imaginative power to see the world as it really is with a complete vision, with complete visionariness. He even thought there were 4 levels of vision. And I'm just talking about this with a few people who know something about vision in the front row here, who you should go see if you have eye troubles. Blake probably should have gone to see them too, but Blake had visions. The stories say that he had his first one when he was 4, and his father punished him for saying that he saw angels sitting in a tree outside his bedroom. So he really did see things that we don't, mostly, and which we might call hallucinations or something, but he thought that there were 4 levels of imaginative pressure. That 4-fold vision was the highest, there was 3-fold, 2-fold, and the lowest one is what he called Newton's sleep. Sorry, ophthalmologists in the front row. And I'll show you a couple of books with that title, recent books, that sciences shrank our vision. Yes, it was impressive what science had done. He admired Newton in a way, but by looking through a telescope or a microscope, we're doing weird things to our eyes, and what we should be doing is seeing through the eyes, not with them, not by means of them. We should be seeing what's imaginatively available in us. And that, I think, is the Blake that meant something to many, many, many people. Those on exhibit upstairs, especially, you must go. It's a terrific exhibit. I only had a chance to see it a few minutes ago, and I felt like tearing up my notes and starting over. But it's that, I think, that meant the most to us. This is a famous quotation. It's upstairs as well. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to men as it is, infinite. Whatever that means. By the way, one of the annoying things about Blake professors is they often give the impression that they understand Blake. Right? And you don't. Right? They can be really annoying. Because I can tell you, after many, many years of studying Blake and reading just about everything written about him, I don't understand Blake. I mean, I understand some bits. I've published on some bits. But fundamentally, I think he still remains beyond most of us. And what drew me to him in the first place was that he's so different from me. I'm a son of the Enlightenment. My father is a scientist. My older sister's a scientist. I was raised in the Unitarian Church. We didn't talk about faith. My old friend William Sloane Coffin used to say, "You Unitarians, you're a little thin in theology, but you're thick in ethics." That's what we thought. It was our job to be good. We didn't have faith. Good Lord. We sought the truth, perhaps. We wanted to be good. But in any case, Blake appealed to me as someone very, very different, and I thought it might be good for me to come out of my Unitarian Sunday school training and try to come to grips with this guy, but he is very difficult. And even his marvelous sayings like this remain, I think, still like tremble with uncertain meanings. Here is where it's from. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear in man as it is, infinite. That, of course, led to Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, which is his study of his report of his peyote experiments. So we're now back in 1954, and even earlier when he was doing this. Blake's influence on interesting things, social developments, whether it's psychological, political, or otherwise, begins quite early. Not in his own lifetime, of course, but by the late 19th century, people were discovering Blake and finding him immensely interesting and inspiring. So here's, of course, Huxley, and there, of course, are the Doors, right, who I think went to Huxley first and then found that Blake was behind it. No? Thank you. Thank you. I'm very glad to be corrected. You see, we professors don't know much about Blake. But I think you probably also read this book, I'm guessing. Definitely. Yes, right. Without question. Okay, good. Yeah. So there's that. Then there's this. This is the great portrait of Blake at age 50. I couldn't get him to look exactly up at Ginsberg. It just, he's looking up there with something, where his muse is. But we know Allen Ginsberg was much inspired by Blake, and I'll just read a bit of this. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz. It's hard to do that in one breath. Who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant cool eyes hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war. And there's more. That's, of course, from Howell, the great book that, of course, led to his prosecution and so on. Blake was essential for Ginsberg. He speaks of seeing a sunflower in one of his poems, Psalm 4. This is one of Blake's notably mysterious little poems called Ah, Sunflower, though I'm inclined to think that it was this that Ginsberg was thinking of. An amazing Blake illustration, which seems to combine something Hindu, because he'd been reading books of Hindu religion and philosophy, with a sunflower. And I think possibly Allen had smoked something or dropped something when he was looking at Blake, and the rest was history. Here are some proverbs of hell from the marriage of heaven and hell, and I've put an arrow by. The tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. And I'll show you something about that. But it got me thinking when I first read these. Well, no, it was more recently than that. But whenever I look at these, I think, wouldn't these make great Chinese fortune cookie fortunes? You know what I mean? I mean, you go to a Chinese restaurant, you get a nice meal, and then you get these very bland cookies with very bland fortunes inside. Like, this is your lucky day. Or be nice to your friends because you never know. Or, right? Or Confucius said something. But wouldn't it be great to get something like this to chew on? You know, the caterpillar, as the caterpillar chooses the fairest leaves to lay eggs on, so the priest lays his curse on the purest joys. Well, wouldn't that be good to drink with your green tea? I mean, so I tried to interest a fortune cookie place, and they just... So at any rate, there we are, the back of Cat Stevens. I didn't see this upstairs. So, yeah. I myself carried that as a sign when I was a graduate student and teaching assistant at Harvard in 1972, I think. We formed a little union of TAs, and we carried signs like, "We can't eat prestige." And that was the good one. And various other things about how poorly we were paid and how much work we did, but I carried that one. I'm not sure what it really meant in that context, but I liked it. So Blake was in the air for us. this amazing thing is based on Blake. It's based on this. Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night. That's a biblical term for the promised land. And twofold always. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. So you see what a muscular, fine fellow Newton is here, right? He's brilliant, isn't sort of Michelangesque in its drawing, but he's in an impossible position, sitting on I don't know what, and underwater it seems. Those may be sea anemones or something. That would be symbolic of being sort of mentally drowned for Blake, losing your vision. But there he is, bent over with the compasses, just like that God illustration. And I think that's what he thought, that God, the God, the creator, was kind of Newton, that he was like trying to put limits and mathematicize everything. And Blake didn't like that. Two books from nearly the same time made use of this. Let me back up. And these two books came out in the late 60s, early 70s. Theodore Rorschach. Anybody read these? I thought they were great at the time. I have not revisited them. I think I'd like to. But Blake was very important, not just in the second one, which has him on the cover. But in an attempt to describe the counterculture, Rorschach found Blake very helpful. Now, one thing that I think Blake helped give us, besides the imagination, well, along with the imagination, and for that, after all, he was seconded by John Lennon, right, in 1971. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Imagine no possessions, I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. That probably had did more for more people than all of Blake. But Blake was already in the air by the time that song came out, and I think Lennon may well have been reading Blake, or certainly Yoko Ono knew about Blake. Just imagine. We were imagining, I think, in the best sense of the word. And those of us who were opposed to the war in Vietnam and resisting the draft and so on, and those of us who are stirring again and try to get feminism relaunched and so on, we're imagining what this country could be. And without, I think, such a vision, we are a little unmoored, or we're just doing single issues, which is sort of like single vision. We're pushing at this, we're trying to protect that. I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a minute, but I think imagination was important to us then, to say this could be better. It wasn't just that we were horrified at what we were doing in Vietnam, but it seemed somehow wrong for America, of all places, to be doing this, because America had this tradition of this being a better place. This was the city on the hill. This was the New Jerusalem, if you will. Do you all know this as a hymn?
Yes.
Oh, good. I've been asking people, and not everyone does. It's very well known in England, of course. If I were in better voice, I would sing it, but the ending is, I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. I have a friend who lives in Connecticut who always sings, in New England's green and pleasant land. It's not sung so much over here for obvious reasons, but Blake wrote it in 1804, but in 1916, Perry set it to music, to the words to the music I just badly reproduced. And it was part of a World War I rallying event for the home front. But Perry was unhappy that it was put to that use. He was no anti-German. He was a composer, after all. He loved German music. Within 2 years, by 1918, the Women's Right to Vote campaign took it up as their theme song. And the Labor Party picked it up. And I believe in the 1926 general strike in England, the workers gathered at Transport House in South London and sang this. So it is sung by the left and it's sung by the right in England, because you could sort of imagine this as a restoration of an earlier time as well. So the Tory party also sings it. And it's sung the last night of the proms, every year in London and at the Royal Albert Hall. But it's also, it's also sung by Billy Bragg, who's a Trotskyist and a very serious lefty. And he says, no, we got to claim this. This is a song for the left. It's a wonderful song. It's the second national anthem of England. But people can sort of project what they like onto it. But I think this song had an influence even here. It is sung sometimes in, I think it's found at Presbyterian hymnals. And it's found, I think it's sung in some private schools in America. But it's sung all the time in England. So Blake's been in the air for 100 years now through this hymn. So Blake wanted us to think about a better place, a world of brotherhood, which leads, I think, to the final point I want to talk about, which is utopia. Blake, right? Isn't that good? We must not forget Paul Goodman, who died 30-something years ago. I knew him slightly. His son was a draft resistor like me, and I got to know him. He knew Blake. He was a visionary like Blake. He tried to imagine the kind of what he called communitas, the name of one of his books, that we could have, that we could make. And he said, you've got to have this. And when people dismiss it as utopian, it means they don't want you to do it. They don't believe in it. But Blake thought this could be possible. And much of Blake, I think, is a kind of psychologizing, or can I say phenomenalizing or phenomenologizing of what it would be like to be in this new world of brotherhood and a kind of non-violent mental struggle, what he called mental fight, in what became the song. And so William Morris, for instance, remains very important reading with his utopia, The News from Nowhere. He knew of Blake, and he, in a way, did just what Blake did. He printed his own books, designed his own books, ran them off in a press, and so on. And he has a wonderfully moving vision of how England could become a true democratic place without violence, without terribly rich people, and so on. He thought it through. Sure, you could find fault with it, but he wasn't like just brainstorming. He was actually trying to imagine how we might get from here to there. And I don't know if, like me, you have a taste for these things, but, did we leave something out? There we are, I'm sorry. These bounce. Do you know these books? Yes. Good. These are only two of several, I think, excellent books that try to imagine different worlds. I don't know, I mean, today everyone's reading dystopian novels, right? And for pretty good reasons. But both of these, I think, are really interesting. I particularly like the Ursula Le Guin one, where she tries to imagine an anarchist society. And she's fairly tough-minded about it. It's not going to be easy running an anarchist society, right? How do you make the trains run on time in an anarchist society, right? You know the saying of Oscar Wilde, the trouble with socialism is that it takes too many evenings. Right? It's true. Anarchism takes even more because you've got to talk everything through, sort of like at Quaker meetings. And if anybody objects, you've got to try to bring this person around and so on. But it's, I think, nonetheless tough-minded and just important to think it, to try to, okay, could this be done? Of course there are barriers. There are many people who would try to stop it and so on. But is it feasible given human nature? And so on. I think this remains important. We're at a time now, and I'll conclude with this thought, that where many of us feel sort of on an emergency footing, trying to prevent worse things from happening than what's already been happening. We have global warming, which is going to come upon us no matter what we do, though we can probably mitigate it if we have enough people doing enough right things. We have we seem to have moved closer to nuclear war than in quite a while. We have a president, about whom I'll say nothing further, who is not making it any easier. So many people say, we don't have time to think about utopia. This is all very nice for Saturday afternoons, but we have got to try to protect this or stop that or do this or something piecemeal. But okay, I feel the force of that too, and we have to. But I think if we lose this vision, if it's not belief, if it's not faith, it is a vision, it is an imagination, we lose the ability to imagine what we could make this country into and make the world into, slowly and fitfully, and no doubt with many revisions and changes as things change. If we lose that, I don't know how we can even sustain the energy to resist the piecemeal things that we need to. I'll stop with that and thank you.